The night of June 5, 1944, was unremarkable along the Atlantic Wall. German sentries stared into the darkness of the English Channel, their breath visible in the cold air, their minds wandering to homes they hadn't seen in years. The concrete bunkers stretched for hundreds of miles, a fortress that Hitler himself had declared impregnable. But beneath the routine of another night shift, beneath the false confidence of Wehrmacht briefings, a catastrophic intelligence failure was already unfolding. The greatest amphibious invasion in human history was hours away, and the men responsible for stopping it were scattered, distracted, and fatally unprepared. When the first paratroopers began landing in the darkness over Normandy, the initial German response wasn't alarm, it was confusion. Local commanders received fragmented reports: enemy soldiers spotted near Saint-Mère-Église, parachutes seen over the Cotentin Peninsula, strange aircraft noises over Caen. But these reports didn't fit the expected pattern. They were too dispersed, too chaotic. Many officers assumed it was a raid, perhaps a diversion. The German military doctrine relied heavily on clear intelligence and decisive command structure, but on this night, both systems were catastrophically compromised. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the only commander who truly understood the threat, wasn't even in France. He had driven to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, convinced that the weather made an invasion impossible. The scattered nature of the Allied airborne drops, a consequence of anti-aircraft fire and navigation errors, paradoxically worked in the Allies' favor. German officers couldn't establish a coherent picture. Was this the main invasion? A feint? Where were the drops concentrated? In the pre-dawn hours, reports flooded into headquarters, each one contradicting the last. Major General Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Infantry Division, directly facing what would become Omaha and Utah beaches, received information about paratroopers but had no clear sense of scale or objective. His standing orders were to repel coastal raids, not respond to a full-scale invasion. The psychological conditioning of German officers worked against them now. They had been told so many times that the Allies would strike at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing point, that Normandy seemed strategically illogical. At Hitler's Berghof retreat in Bavaria, the Führer smapped. His staff knew better than to wake him without absolute certainty, and certainty was the one thing no German commander possessed that night. This delay would prove catastrophic. The German military system, despite its reputation for efficiency, had become dangerously centralized around Hitler's personal authority. Major decisions, especially the deployment of panzer reserves, required his explicit approval. But Hitler was asleep, his doctors had administered sedatives, and his aides were paralyzed by protocol and fear. The same fear that kept millions under totalitarian control now prevented the swift military response that might have turned the tide. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, chief of operations at OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, faced the ultimate bureaucratic nightmare. Reports suggested something significant was happening in Normandy, but launching the panzer divisions, the only force capable of throwing the Allies back into the sea, required waking the Führer. Jodl hesitated. In a normal military structure, field commanders would have authority to respond to immediate threats, but Nazi Germany wasn't a normal military structure. It was a system built on personal loyalty, paranoia, and the absolute supremacy of one man's judgment. Every major general and field marshal had learned the consequences of acting without permission. Some had been executed, others had been humiliated, stripped of command, sent to disgrace. This culture of fear, so effective at maintaining Hitler's grip on power, now paralyzed the entire defensive response. As dawn approached, reality began to penetrate the fog of confusion. Naval observers reported an unprecedented number of ships materializing off the Normandy coast. Not dozens, hundreds, not a raid, an armada. The sheer scale finally broke through the denial. This was the invasion. But even as the truth became undeniable, the response remained fractured. Communication systems damaged by French resistance sabotage and Allied air raids struggled to coordinate between divisions. Commanders gave orders that contradicted each other. Units were sent to the wrong sectors. The vaunted German military machine, so effective in offensive warfare, revealed its critical weakness in defensive coordination.
The first coherent German assessment came from Major General Edgar Feutinger, commander of the 21st Panzer Division stationed near Caen. His division represented exactly the kind of mobile armored force that could have devastated the Allied beachheads in their most vulnerable first hours. But Feutinger found himself trapped in the Kafkaesque bureaucracy of Nazi military command. He had tanks, trained crews, and a clear tactical opportunity, but he lacked permission to move. The standing orders were explicit. Panzer divisions could not be deployed without authorization from OKW, which meant authorization from Hitler himself. As British paratroopers consolidated their positions around the Orne bridges and American forces waded ashore under withering fire, Feuchtinger could only wait, his frustration mounting with each passing minute. When Feuchtinger finally received permission to move, hours after the invasion began, his response revealed both the capability and the delusion that characterized German military thinking. "If they want war at 7 in the morning, they can have it," he reportedly said, betraying a fundamental misunderstanding of what was unfolding. This wasn't a localized engagement that could be contained by a single panzer division. This was the culmination of years of Allied planning, involving thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men, and complete air superiority. But German officers, conditioned by years of victories in Poland, France, and the early Soviet campaigns, still believed in the decisive counterattack, the brilliant maneuver that would shatter enemy formations and restore the front. That confidence, once justified by German tactical superiority, was now a dangerous fantasy. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Supreme Commander West, received the full picture of the invasion later that morning. His reaction was characteristic of the professional military men who had watched Hitler's strategic incompetence compound over years of war. Von Rundstedt was old Prussian aristocracy, a career officer who viewed war through the cold lens of logistics, geography, and force ratios. Unlike the Nazi ideologues who surrounded Hitler, he understood exactly what the Normandy landings meant. The Western Allies had achieved the strategic surprise that German intelligence had insisted was impossible. They had concentrated overwhelming force at a point that German high command had considered secondary, and most critically, they had done so with complete air dominance, which meant that any German counterattack would be conducted under constant aerial bombardment. Von Rundstedt's famous response to his chief of staff encapsulated the dawning realization. "They're landing? So what? We must throw them back into the sea." But the confident words masked a bitter awareness of reality. The forces available to throw the Allies back were nowhere near adequate. The best divisions were in Russia, being ground down in Stalin's meat grinder. The Atlantic Wall, that supposed masterpiece of defensive engineering, was undermanned and under-equipped. Many bunkers lacked sufficient ammunition. Infantry divisions were filled with older men, conscripts from occupied territories with dubious loyalty, and soldiers recuperating from wounds received on other fronts. The elite Waffen-SS divisions that might have made a difference were held in reserve, awaiting Hitler's personal orders. Throughout the morning, as reports clarified the scale of the invasion, German officers began the psychological process of reconciling their expectations with reality. For years, Nazi propaganda had assured them of inevitable victory. The Atlantic Wall was impregnable, German military superiority was axiomatic, the Allies were weak, divided, incapable of the coordination required for such an operation. Now, watching an armada that stretched to the horizon and witnessing air cover so complete that Luftwaffe planes were simply absent from the sky, many experienced a profound cognitive dissonance. Major General Wilhelm Folly, commander of the 91st Infantry Division, was killed by American paratroopers while racing back to his headquarters. He never even reached his command post to organize a defense. His death symbolized the chaos and unpreparedness that characterized the German response. At Hitler's headquarters, the Führer finally awoke late in the morning. His immediate reaction demonstrated how completely divorced from military reality he had become. Rather than immediately releasing the panzer reserves for counterattack, Hitler launched into strategic speculation. Was Normandy the real invasion, or was it a diversion before the main assault at Pas-de-Calais? This question, planted by the Allied deception Operation Fortitude, paralyzed German strategic thinking for crucial days. Hitler had convinced himself, based on intelligence reports manufactured by Allied double agents, that General George Patton would lead the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais. The fact that Patton was actually in England commanding a phantom army, a masterstroke of deception, didn't occur to the German high command. They saw what they expected to see, and their expectations were expertly manipulated. General der Artillerie Erich Marx, commanding 84th Corps in Normandy, understood immediately that this was the decisive moment of the war in the West. June 6th was actually his birthday, and he had been celebrating with his staff when the invasion began. His response was grimly professional. "It's begun. The war, the whole war, is at stake." Marx, who had lost a leg on the Eastern Front, represented the generation of German officers who had fought in both world wars, who had seen empires collapse and nations remade. He possessed no illusions about Nazi invincibility or ideological destiny. He saw the invasion through the eyes of a career soldier who understood logistics, force concentration, and strategic momentum, and what he saw terrified him.
The Allies had achieved what the Germans had failed to do in 1940. They had crossed the Channel in force, and they were bringing everything with them.
As the afternoon of June 6th progressed, the fragmented German command structure began to comprehend the catastrophic dimensions of their failure. Admiral Theodor Krunke, commanding Naval Group West, compiled reports from coastal observers and naval units that painted a picture of unprecedented scale. His communications to OKWKW carried an undercurrent of disbelief. Over 5,000 ships, a figure so vast it seemed like exaggeration or panic. But it wasn't panic, it was precision. The Allies had assembled the largest invasion fleet in human history, and German naval forces were essentially powerless to interfere. The Kriegsmarine, once envisioned as the instrument of Britain's starvation and defeat, had been reduced to scattered submarines and small patrol boats. The surface fleet that might have contested the Channel was gone, sunk in earlier battles or trapped in Norwegian fjords. Krunke's reports reflected the bitter acknowledgement of a navy that existed in name only, incapable of influencing the decisive battle unfolding on its doorstep. The Luftwaffe's absence from the skies over Normandy became a source of humiliation and rage among German ground commanders. Where were the fighters? Where were the bombers that had terrorized Warsaw, Rotterdam, and London? Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had promised that enemy aircraft would never penetrate German airspace, that the Luftwaffe would crush any invasion attempt. Now, German soldiers looked up to see uncontested swarms of Allied aircraft, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, operating with complete impunity. Pilots who did manage to sortie encountered overwhelming numbers and were either shot down or forced to flee. The psychological impact on German troops was profound. Air superiority had been a German advantage in every campaign from 1939 to 1942. Now it belonged exclusively to the enemy, and with it came constant bombardment, interdiction of supplies, and the destruction of any force concentration. Officers attempting to move reinforcements to the beaches found their columns shattered by fighter bombers before they could even reach the front lines. General der Panzertruppen Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, commanding Panzergroup West, embodied the strategic paralysis that characterized the German High Command. He advocated for massing the Panzer divisions inland, away from naval bombardment, where they could launch a coordinated counterattack against Allied forces once they had penetrated beyond the beaches. This was sound mobile warfare doctrine: concentrate armor, strike decisively, exploit breakthroughs. But it required unity of command and freedom of action, neither of which existed in the Nazi military structure. Rommel had argued for positioning panzers close to the coast, ready to throw invaders back into the sea within hours. Hitler had compromised, placing the reserves under his personal control, satisfying no one, and ensuring that the tanks would arrive neither early enough to prevent the landings nor in sufficient concentration to destroy the beachheads. Von Schweppenberg watched his carefully planned mobile defense dissolve into piecemeal commitments, individual divisions thrown into battle without coordination or adequate support. The psychological shock of D-Day extended beyond tactical surprise to a deeper existential crisis. Many German officers had invested their entire identity in the myth of German military supremacy. They had witnessed the lightning victories of 1939 and 1940, the seemingly unstoppable advance into Russia in 1941. They had been told and had come to believe that German discipline, training, and tactical innovation made them superior to any opponent. The Normandy invasion shattered this mythology with brutal efficiency. The Allies had demonstrated superior planning, superior logistics, superior intelligence, and superior coordination. The meticulous deception operations, the precisely timed airborne insertions, the overwhelming naval and air support, all of it revealed that the Allies had matched and exceeded German operational capability. For officers whose entire worldview rested on assumptions of superiority, this was not just a military defeat, but a psychological earthquake. Lieutenant General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, commanding the forces in the Cotentin Peninsula, found himself facing the American advance toward Cherbourg with wholly inadequate forces. His communications to headquarters carried the distinctive tone of a professional officer watching a military disaster unfold in slow motion. He requested reinforcements, ammunition, air support, all the elements necessary for effective defense. The responses he received were vague promises and strategic abstractions. Hitler's headquarters spoke of new wonder weapons, of strategic reserves that would turn the tide, of the enemy's supposed logistical weakness.
But von Schlieben was on the ground, watching American forces expand their beachhead with methodical efficiency, and he knew that rhetoric would not stop tanks. His reports grew increasingly desperate, increasingly frank. The fortress mentality that Hitler demanded, hold every position to the last man, collided with the military reality that fixed defenses without mobile reserves were simply targets waiting to be reduced by overwhelming firepower. Field Marshal Hugo Sperling, commanding Luftwaffe 3, responsible for air operations over France, faced perhaps the most humiliating situation of any German commander that day. His aircraft were outmatched, outnumbered, and increasingly grounded by lack of fuel. The strategic bombing campaign against German oil production was beginning to bite, limiting the sortie rates even for units that still possessed operational aircraft. Sperling's communications reflected the impotence of a once mighty air force reduced to irrelevance. He could not contest the skies over Normandy. He could not interdict the invasion fleet. He could not provide the close air support that German ground forces desperately needed. Every doctrinal principle of German combined arms warfare, the coordination of infantry, armor, and air power that had proven so devastatingly effective in earlier campaigns, was now impossible. The Luftwaffe had become a ghost organization. Its former glory existed only in propaganda films and fading memories. As darkness fell on June 6th, the scale of the Allied lodgment became undeniable. Despite ferocious resistance at Omaha Beach, despite local German counterattacks, despite the courage of individual soldiers fighting from prepared positions, the fundamental strategic reality was inescapable. The Allies were ashore in force, and they were staying. General Marx, surveying the situation from his headquarters, understood that the war's trajectory had fundamentally shifted. In conversations with subordinates, he spoke with the fatalistic clarity of a man who sees the ending even as others cling to hope. The Wehrmacht could still fight, could still inflict casualties, could still conduct tactical retreats and local counterattacks, but the strategic initiative had passed permanently to the Allies. Germany would now fight a three-front war, east, west, and south, with dwindling resources, collapsing logistics, and no prospect of victory.
In the days immediately following June 6th, as the initial shock began to crystallize into strategic assessment, the private conversations among German officers revealed a spectrum of responses, ranging from defiant denial to quiet desperation. Major General Max Pemsel, Chief of Staff to the 7th Army, became one of the first senior officers to articulate what many were thinking, but few dared to say aloud. In conversations recorded by military stenographers, a practice Hitler had instituted to monitor his generals, Pemsel spoke with cold analytical precision about the impossibility of the situation. The Atlantic Wall had not failed because of cowardice or poor construction. It had failed because the strategic concept was fundamentally flawed. Static defenses, no matter how formidable, could not prevail against an enemy with total air and naval superiority, unlimited industrial capacity, and the ability to concentrate overwhelming force at a point of their choosing. Pemsel's assessment was professionally sound, but in Nazi Germany, professional honesty was increasingly dangerous. Officers who spoke too frankly about military realities risked being labeled defeatists, a designation that could lead to removal from command, disgrace, or worse. The generational divide within the German officer corps became starkly visible in the aftermath of D-Day. Older officers, products of the Imperial German Army and veterans of the First World War, tended toward realistic assessments based on mathematics and logistics. They understood that modern industrial warfare was ultimately decided by production capacity, resource availability, and the ability to replace losses. Younger officers, especially those who had risen through the ranks during the Nazi period and whose formative military experiences were the seemingly miraculous victories of 1939-1941, clung more desperately to the ideology of willpower and tactical brilliance overcoming material disadvantage. This divide manifested in strategic debates that became increasingly bitter as the summer of 1944 progressed. Should Germany seek a political settlement? Should resources be concentrated on one front at the expense of others? Could defensive operations buy time for wonder weapons to enter production? These questions had no good answers, but they consumed countless hours in headquarters far from the fighting, while soldiers in Normandy bled and died in battles that professional officers increasingly recognized as strategically meaningless. The psychological weight of defending the indefensible fell heavily on middle-ranking officers, the colonels and lieutenant colonels who commanded the regiments and battalions actually fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy. These men faced an impossible task.
They were expected to hold positions against an enemy with unlimited artillery ammunition, constant air support, and steady reinforcement, while their own units dwindled through attrition without adequate replacement. Captured German officers, interrogated by Allied intelligence, revealed a common pattern of disillusionment. Many spoke of orders from higher headquarters that bore no relationship to conditions on the ground, of being commanded to hold villages that were already behind enemy lines, of counterattacks launched with insufficient forces against prepared positions. The Wehrmacht's vaunted tactical flexibility, the doctrine of mission-type orders that gave junior officers latitude to achieve objectives using their own judgment, had been strangled by Hitler's insistence on holding every meter of ground. Officers who might have conducted skillful fighting withdrawals, preserving their forces for more favorable engagements, were instead ordered to stand and die in place. SS Brigadeführer Fritz Witt, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, represented a different category of German officer entirely. A true believer in Nazi ideology, Witt led a division composed largely of teenage volunteers from the Hitlerjugend, indoctrinated from childhood in racial superiority and fanatical loyalty. When his division finally entered combat against Canadian forces north of Caen, they fought with suicidal ferocity, taking and inflicting casualties at rates that shocked even veteran Allied units. But Witt's radio communications back to headquarters revealed an emerging crisis even among the ideologically committed. His young soldiers were brave to the point of recklessness, but bravery could not compensate for the vast material disparity. They had no answer to the Allied artillery, which could bring down devastating barrages within minutes of any German movement. They had no defense against the fighter bombers that circled constantly overhead, destroying any vehicle that moved during daylight. Witt himself was killed by naval gunfire on June 14th, his command post struck by shells from Allied warships far out to sea. His death symbolized the futility of courage without corresponding capability. No amount of ideological fervor could overcome the simple physics of high explosive shells. As June gave way to July, a grim fatalism settled over the German command structure in Normandy. Officers began speaking in terms of buying time rather than achieving victory, of making the Allies pay for every kilometer rather than driving them back into the sea. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who replaced von Rundstedt after the latter's increasingly frank assessments angered Hitler, arrived in France still believing that proper tactics and determination could stabilize the front. Within days, his communications to OKW began to mirror those of his predecessor. The situation was not sustainable. Allied material superiority was crushing. The Luftwaffe remained absent. Casualties were mounting faster than replacements could arrive. Von Kluge, like so many before him, discovered that reality had a way of overwhelming ideology, that tonnage of steel delivered was more decisive than strength of will. His transformation from confident newcomer to exhausted pessimist took less than 2 weeks, a trajectory that would be repeated by every German commander who came to Normandy expecting to replicate the tactical miracles of earlier campaigns. The final illusion shattered in late July when American forces achieved the breakout at St. Lo. Operation Cobra, preceded by carpet bombing that obliterated German forward positions, broke through the defensive crust and released American armored divisions into the French interior. German officers watching the breakout understood immediately what it meant. The containment had failed. The front was collapsing. Mobile warfare, the kind of warfare at which German commanders excelled, was now working against them as American tanks ranged freely through rear areas, cutting supply lines and encircling defensive positions. General der Panzertruppen Hans Eberbach, tasked with organizing a counterattack to seal the breach, spoke with weary resignation about the impossibility of the mission. He lacked fuel for sustained operations, he lacked air cover, he lacked reserves to exploit any local success. But orders were orders, and in Nazi Germany, questioning orders was more dangerous than executing futile attacks. The final act of delusion came with Hitler's order for a counterattack at Mortain in early August. The plan, to drive west to the coast at Avranches, cutting off the American breakout, was strategically absurd and tactically impossible. Every professional officer recognized it as such. Von Kluge pleaded for permission to conduct a fighting retreat to more defensible positions. His pleas were rejected. The attack went forward, achieved minimal gains, and resulted in German forces being trapped in the Falaise pocket, where they were systematically destroyed by Allied air and ground forces. Survivors of the Falaise encirclement, interrogated after their capture or escape, spoke of an apocalypse, endless bombing, roads clogged with burning vehicles, horses screaming, units dissolving into panicked mobs of fugitives. The professional German army, the force that had conquered most of Europe, died in the fields of Normandy. What emerged from the ruins would be increasingly a militia of old men and children, led by officers who knew the war was lost but lacked the courage or means to end it. The words spoken by German officers on D-Day, confusion, denial, defiance, had given way by summer's end to a final recognition. The invasion had succeeded, and with it, the Third Reich's fate was sealed.